Welcome to the podcast, David Minas. Thanks for being here today.
Thanks for having me, David. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, pleasure. So you're a CFO with phenomenal experience. I don't know where to start. If I had to go through the things you've done, it's almost easier to talk about maybe what you haven't done, but we're not going to go there because that's not a nice way to kick off. But maybe just a quick, hello to the audience, introducing yourself.
Sure, thanks. So to give you some context, I started my career many years ago at Ernst & Young, got my CA there. It's now a CPA. I work specifically in financial institution, banks, insurance companies, trust companies, brokerages, and got a lot of experience there. When I left the firm, I ended up going to Scotiabank. And at Scotiabank was an area where that's what really intrigued me about the CFO function. So initially I went in policy and worked on policy with respect to derivative products, capital markets, products that were fairly new at the time, but they've been out for quite some time. And I worked with the Canadian Bankers Associations and other banks in drafting pronouncements and that type of thing. After a while, they thought I had some ability, they being management of the bank, and got me to run the Bank Act project, which was about a year long and won a National Service Award. After that, they came to me and said, how would you like to run the Mortgage Corp as the CFO on an interim basis? I was quite young. I was shocked, scared. All I knew was the right answer was yes. So I said yes. And I figured, okay, I got to go and try to figure this out. Work. So this is a company with billions of dollars of revenue, $1 billion of assets, and had a team of 42 and had never done it before. So I knew that I had to try to figure this out. And how do I do this? To make a long story short, the year went by really fast. Had a lot of issues with respect to people, managed through that, made an acquisition. Acquisition in my life actually was the first one. It was $4.5 billion, and integrated those assets into Scotiabank. Worked really closely with the president, loved everything about the role. Then the person came back from maternity leave, took a role back, and I went back to accounting policy. And I thought, how do I get this CFO role? People told me and said, well, you can't have a CFO role because one, you have to have more M&A transactions behind you. You have to raise capital. You have to have system implementation. You have to have managed people, tax. So I thought, okay, well, I'm going to have to try to figure out how to get those pieces under my belt in order to get this role. So the rest of my career was strategically picking roles along the way that could actually get those skill set. So people couldn't come back and say, you don't have this or you don't have that. And that's how my career got started, and stayed as the CFO ever since.
Wow, that's fantastic. Like the setting intention towards a goal, which was to become a CFO, and really just the building blocks along the way. So thinking about the step after the next step, and not necessarily getting either too comfortable, maybe not being afraid of a company that didn't have all the things you wanted, but you were really specific about the certain types of experience you wanted to gain, which is really cool and a really good lesson for folks embarking on any career, frankly. So you talked about the M&A deal that you had never done before. That's the challenge a lot of times. If you haven't done something, I mean, there always has to be a first. And so you
Correct.
always need someone to trust you to take it on, or the right mentorship. Maybe just talk about that first deal. Like, did you just go back to basic principles? Did you have people around you showing you the way?
Yeah, good point. I was lucky because I was working for Scotiabank at the time, and they had an M&A transaction group. So given I was the CFO for Scotia Mortgage, I worked very closely with them and walked through the whole process. They kind of guided me as to how to go through this process. And for me, it was an eye-opener because there was so much involved in it. And I would have never made it without their assistance. So it was very helpful to have them there and guide me through this. But that experience sticks with you. It gave me the confidence later to say, hey, I know how to do these. I can do this in the future, and don't necessarily need all that assistance going forward into the future. Without their help, I don't think I would have been able to have that opportunity. If it's a much smaller deal, it might have story, but this is $4.5 billion. And that was the biggest check of my life I ever signed.
Yeah, no doubt. And you also then subsequently did 23 deals, I think is the number.
Yep.
That's a lot of transactions. So I'd love to hear a little bit more, what some of the keys to success were, lessons along the way, and, when responding, what's the impact the CFO has on M&A? And I guess to add a 10th part to the question, is any size deal, is the complexity sometimes even greater? Like how much of it is driven by the size of the deal? You mentioned 4 billion, but do the small deals also require, just as many steps a lot of times?
Okay. So I'm going to start from the beginning there. I think when you look at this, a CFO has to be a strategic partner with the CEO. So you have to work with the CEO in order to have a strategy and say, what is it that we want to do? How do we want to build this company? How do we grow? And look at targets as to, are they actually going to provide this? You have to remember, empirically, M&A deals mostly fail on the majority and do not be accretive to your company. So you have to be very careful to make sure you're successful on it. And you got to remember as well that growing organically, there's nothing wrong with that. So what I have found in my career is that when I was working at Ernst & Young and I worked in M&A due diligence, there was one company in particular that was so bent on making an acquisition. And we were the ones that were the advisors and went in there, and it didn't make any sense from a number of perspectives to do this deal. So we had advised them not to do this deal, but they were very emotional about it, very attached to it, and very vested in the process. And because they were vested and very emotional, they weren't listening. They went ahead and guess what happened after a couple of years? It was a severe failure. The company went out of business. The acquirer went out of business. It just took too many of their resources. It was exactly what we thought. So my lesson from that is you need to be able to not be so emotional. You need to be systematic about it and too vested. If it doesn't work, walk away. Be courageous. Walk away. There's always another deal. There's always another opportunity. The worst case scenario is you are where you are, which is not a bad place, and you can keep looking. And this is where companies and CFOs get in trouble, is because they lack patience. So I would say that's probably the biggest takeaway I would take from that. To your second part of your question, you mentioned about any size, complexity. So yes, the steps are all the same. You still have to go through the same steps. But as they get bigger, there could be more complexity. Or there could be complexity in smaller ones as well, depending on what they have, the ownership structure, what's involved in the company. Do they have any relationships, partnerships out there that you need to look into? Specifically with M&A deals, the key here is make sure about the liabilities. Look for undisclosed. They're the ones that are going to kill you. So they could be things such as lawsuits, maybe even things like employees' vacation pay that has never been recorded, approved, but it's out there and you owe them a ton of money. So these are things that you have to be really careful about. When it comes to size, you still have to go through all the steps. It just might take longer.
Yeah. Yeah. When you're in a CFO role, you've got a lot of responsibilities, and then a transaction comes up and you're going to acquire a business. That seems like a pretty big distraction from your day job. How do you navigate that? Is that assembling the right team, or just staying up all night? Like, what do you recommend to folks?
Yeah, so it really depends on your CEO. It depends on your. I think assembling the right team is the right way to do it. You need people on your team that can actually assist you. You're right. You have to keep the business running. You have to allocate certain. You have to be a good delegator. You have to be able to allocate certain jobs to people to keep things going. The CFO has to make sure as well that the business is scalable, that the infrastructure is there. Because if you're going to make this acquisition, you got to make sure that you have the systems, the processes, and people in place that actually can accept this. Because if you swallow it, it could hurt the company. Yes, you put in extra hours, but you have to be able to utilize your team And if you have the budget, you can go externally and actually help get due diligence services from an outside firm. But in most cases, if you're in a specific industry, you don't do that because they turn around, your CEO or your owners will say, you know the business better than they do. You go do it. You say, yep, I can do that. So this is where your time commitment comes in. And this is where companies get in trouble because they turn around and say, I've invested so much time into this. You know, the deal is iffy or it might work. Let's go for it. That's wrong because you're just going to put yourself in a difficult position because you're emotional, you're tired, you're not patient, and you don't want to go through this process again. So back to your point, yes, you're going to have to allocate and within your own team, and it takes a lot of extra hours. I can't tell you the number of times I've been up till like 1 in the morning working on a deal, try to finish it off, or even later. So you just have to do the appropriate work, and unfortunately, extra work is done.
So what does a deal look like that you walk away from, or you hesitate to proceed with? And what are the things you see? What does a CFO notice that maybe a CEO may not?
You can see things such as inconsistencies when you're talking to the management of the target of their story. You need to look into things such as contracts, the revenue stream. The revenue stream may not be as strong as they say. It might be contingent on certain things. They're not really giving you the. You need to do your due diligence to ensure that that's in fact true. You don't want to be overpaying for something. You got to turn around and look at, again, liabilities are really key here to determine, um, what are the true liabilities? Because a lot of times they won't be forthcoming. If you don't ask, you won't find out. And sometimes consistencies in the stories, and you're not getting the information you need, and you're finding it's not quite what it seems to be, then it probably isn't. And that's probably, you need to be able to verify everything. And you can tell through discussions with management of the target company whether they give you, uh, if they're forthcoming and they're upfront about everything and they provide you all the information, you typically can have some trust in that. Ones that are kind of backing off, well, we have that somewhere, or we can find that and get it back to you later, and it never comes. These are things where they're just signs of, you should be questioning the validity if it's actually in
Right,
fact true.
right. Trust is key. David, let's turn positive, not the deals that you don't like, but the
Sure.
deals that succeed. Can you share a success story, maybe an outcome that, yeah, you would like to highlight?
Sure. So I would say that there's a couple of them actually. When I was at Discount, we went out and we were trying to become more of a national player so that we could attract national players for in terms of revenue. And we had a big hole, I would say, kind of in the Maritimes. So we went out and we were courting an individual who had a big chunk of locations in the Maritimes, PEI, New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, and well, small extent some in Newfoundland. And so if we were to acquire this individual, this would have been very helpful for us to get that extra revenue, become more of a national player. This individual he was very difficult to work with, but he had a good business. Eventually, we ended up cutting a deal with him about a year and a half later, and it turned out to be very accretive. We paid for it back, the deal itself, in about a year and a half, and it really helped us vault us to get to those national deals before. We changed the processes that he was running on those, linked it into our systems, brought in some of our people, uh, created our own culture there, and it was very beneficial to our company. I would say it was huge in terms of getting us to the next level.
So this is, you mentioned Discount, a place I think you spent a significant amount of time, just about 9 years. I'd love to hear the evolution of a business and a success story that led to an ultimate outcome, and kind of along the way some of the steps that you took in building value for the business. You just spoke to it a little bit, becoming a national player. What else can you share around just the building blocks of enhancing and creating value?
So when you think of value, there's a chain that you'd have to do in order to create value. Most companies gather information. You need to analyze the information, interpret the information, conclude, recommend, and you need to be able to take some action and then help create some value for it. With discount, there was a lot of internal things that we needed to fix. Working capital, worked pretty hard on that initially. And in the first couple of years, brought in significant amount of money from working capital because it wasn't really being run properly in terms of the receivables. Use that money to push to the fleet. The question then is, what kind of fleet do you put it into? So it was originally more insurance and retail. And how do we try to get that income stream across the year, steady over the year, as opposed to be more of a seasonal player, so that we can actually drive up? So we determined that the best way to do it would be we used a something called a NOx, a net operating cost for all our vehicles, and tried to determine what vehicles were going to be give us the most profitability. We determined those would be SUVs, trucks, and certain types of cars. And we turned around, who would be the best group to actually rent these to? So we identified what those groups would be, and we wanted to minimize our touch points. So by minimizing touch points, if you think of retail, people rent a car for a day or two, you have to clean them out. And as a result of that, you're still employing a lot of people. But if you have them rented out for a couple months at a time, you don't really need as many people. So that kind of helps reduce your SG&A. So we were looking at that saying, okay, well, let's try to emphasize more on the corporate side and get film accounts. So we put more on the corporate side where we could push it across the country, which tied into our strategy of being more of a national player. That actually helped us a lot in terms of driving revenue and profitability. We looked at the timeline of how long we're going to hold vehicles, identified the optimal range, and then flipped them out and sold them and got other cars in to replace them, which was beneficial to our customers because our customers turned around and said, hey, these cars are pretty new. We like working with you guys. And not only that, but it was actually very profitable for us. So then we looked at and said, okay, we'll be having a hard time in terms of how do we increase profitability? And I looked at the insurance, whereas had every vehicle insured, but our utilization wasn't 100%. So it was more around the 85% range. So that means we're overspending by about 15%. So we struck a deal with the insurers to have it rented on rental days. So that saved us about 15%, which was in the millions, which was a big amount of money. Broke it down by rental days, by province, by type of asset, by type of industry that it's in, specified looking at it from a risk perspective. So if you use a risk approach, the insurance company was very understanding about that because that's what they understand is risk. Similarly, we went back to the bank and said, okay, I understand how you work because I had worked in banks. You're all about risk. Let's cut a deal. If I'm generating a lot of cash coming in, my risk is dropping. You need to drop my interest rates. If I'm not generating a lot of cash, my risk is increasing. You need to increase your rates. So we created a scale. So it really motivated the team to work really hard towards getting that cash in, profitability, and as a result of that, dropped our interest rate by half, which was significant, especially on dollars we had, which was over $500 million. That hit the bottom line as well. So it's thinking differently and not following the normal trends and trying to understand where the other side being the bank, the insurer, your customers, how does it impact us? And how is that going to drive money back to us?
Yeah, that's phenomenal. Just sort of value add throughout there, from top line to bottom line, and then the ability to take it a step further and think outside the box. I wonder if folks don't as often recognize the opportunity to say, hey, something's changed in the business, go back to the bank, renegotiate. And so understanding all of that, seems like a ton of value that you're bringing. I wonder if you'd share a story that I think you had shared with me around vehicles within the world of rentals, and how certain vehicles are more common than others, and it's tied to the NOx concept you mentioned. I'd love to hear that story.
Sure. So everybody knows about cars and trucks. They all have a favorite car or truck. And we were very analytical about it and broke them down by every single manufacturer, every vehicle type, and we had a cost associated with it. And we knew what that cost was. But some of them actually pay to hold these vehicles. I know it sounds like an odd concept, but there were certain vehicles, and we did the calculation, said, okay, by holding these vehicles, we're going to make X, and we're not paying anything. We're actually getting this out of it. We're going, okay, this is good. We're going to get rental money coming in. We're going to be able to satisfy a customer because they want this, and we're going to make some really good money when we sell it on the way out. So we're making on both ends of the transaction. So we identified vehicles, and when we did that, we back to what I said earlier, is we had to try to figure out who wants those vehicles, who wants to rent those vehicles, because we want to put as many out there as possible, because that's going to drive our profitability. But at the same time, there are certain vehicles out there that you have to hold, because even though they're costing you a lot of money, because you need to keep those national accounts going. I'll give you an example. So you said BMWs. Well, BMWs have the highest depreciation rate, but somebody has a BMW, gets into a car accident, the insurance company sends them to us, and we had to replace them. He's not going to be happy with getting a Toyota or something else. He wants to have like for like. So he would get his BMW, and we'd have certain vehicles. So that's where the strategic part comes in. You've got to make your partners happy. And so it's looking at that mix and saying, we don't want to have too many of them because that's going to lose us money. So what's the optimal number? And this is where a good CFO comes in and their team for calculating those and being able to say, this is how to optimize, but still keep everybody happy.
Yeah, that's a great lesson. Sometimes the chasing every dollar in the near term or the immediate is not the right play for the bigger strategic picture for the business. Why don't we move away from that piece and maybe come back to the value of a CFO that you had addressed a couple of times there, and we've also talked about this a little bit, the controller, which is a really important part of any finance function, all the way down to the day-to-day bookkeeping, and where that distinction is really in terms of what you've seen that controllers can bring to the table, and maybe where they can't, and where a CFO really enhances and delivers value.
Sure. So, controllers are typically tactical. So, when I talked about the value chain, what do? They gather information, they process the information, create the statements. It's a valuable piece. There's also the next piece where they have analysis around it. And they're also supposed to be looking at controls and safeguarding the assets at the same time. But that's a lot of work. And so they're very focused in the detail and they're good at what they do. But that's as far as they typically kind of go. And where the CFO, distinguishing factor with the CFO is, comes in and will help interpret that information, be able to come up with conclusions, recommend, help take some action, create, and go tie it back to the strategy, and be a partner with the CEO in terms of how do we align this to our strategy going forward? What are we going to do? And that information that comes from the controller that's pulling that information together, sure, it has to be timely, it has to be accurate, it has to be complete, will help give that the CFO and the CEO information that they can get and create actions that they can drive value from. So you need both parties. They both have a purpose. I think that if there was no CFO, it would be way too much for a controller. And you got to remember, controllers are earlier in their career and haven't seen as much and don't have as much experience. So it's a good fit between the two. If you can get a good controller and a good CFO together, it can be pretty powerful.
And so on that note, there are, I guess, and there's an evolution within the finance function, technology and enablement. You've spent a lot of time in your career working with technology, IT and systems implementations, ERPs. What's your sense of where things are in terms of how technology is impacting the finance function, and then the role a CFO plays when it comes to technology?
There's three things when it comes to the CFO function. If you think about, you have to have systems, process, and people. What's really important as a CFO is to be able to understand the systems and what they can do for you, how you can extract that information out and be able to use that information back to my value chain that I was talking about to create value. I was fortunate in my early part of my career, as I mentioned earlier, I had that opportunity with Scotia Mortgage Corp. At that time, I realized, they said, what kind of background do you have in systems? My next role that I took from there was I worked at TD Securities and I worked in systems research and development. What did we do? We created and implemented systems for the capital market. So there's a whole process around that. That's what helps drive information back to the decision makers to be able to make the right decisions and grow the business. Systems are very important. If you know how they work, a good CFO can actually be part of that process to identify we need to change a system. What can we change it to? Be part of the process and working with system implementers so that you can be on time, so that you can uh, meet the needs of the business and hopefully be on cost too. I've seen some CFOs that have no idea about systems and how to make change, and that hampers the ability for the company to move forward. You know, good transaction, like I mentioned before, we have a discount, being able to bring it in and make it accretive and help grow that business. You need to have a system that's scalable, and you need to be able to put it on and put more acquisitions on. But in order to do that, you need a good system, you need good processes, and you need good people around it. And this is where the depth and breadth of a good CFO is important to be able to put that in place and create the value for the company. Hopefully, I answered your question.
Yeah, you did. I think having a conversation on technology though without mentioning AI is a miss. So I'm going to bring that in here. Yeah, what's your sense of sort of AI revolution? Where are we? Where's it going? And yeah, what have you been paying attention to?
Yeah, it's I actually like the whole concept because AI is it's adaptive. So it sees the way things are happening, what behaviors people have within the company, and it kind of predicts what you're doing. It's good, it's positive, and it's also negative. But you can take the negative into a positive, and I'll give you an example. So when I was at Discount, kind of I would say like early stage AI, but not quite AI, um, we had we had a huge fleet. And because we didn't hold our cars on for very long, we didn't need to have specific oil changes. Regular oil changes were fine, but we were using synthetic oil, which is about $50 more an oil change. At thousands and thousands of vehicles, that's a cost that you really don't need. So the system would actually pump it out and say, here's all the synthetic oil changes that you have. We're looking going, why are we doing this? So we had to talk to the operations people to actually change it. So back to your point about AI, this will be positive because it'll be able to highlight for the CFO to say, look what's happening within your business. Do you really want this? And that's where the decision maker, the CFO or CEO or controller, whoever it may be, can look at this and say, this doesn't make any sense. And we need to address this. And AI, you can use that as a tool to be your analytics, to give you that information so that you can take an action on it. Similarly, it can also help you from the negative side, which is, for example, identifying fraud. So you might find going through that are unusual, look into it and find some fraudulent behavior on that. So I think AI is going to be very useful as long as you um, use it in a way that can actually pull out information to your benefit. And you can also steer it because it learns from what you want and it pulls out behaviors. It's embedded in software now. So when you do a new software, just recently I was on a contract with a client and they're looking to change the system. And one of the things I really wanted was that AI component for that very reason of being able to give that analytics and be able to some of the pieces. And it does do that. And as the future goes and the software changes, it's going to be able to provide a lot more. So we need to be on top of it.
Yeah, it's an exciting future, but I do like the idea of it being more of, as they used to, Microsoft term, the co-pilot, and having it as really enabling the CFO versus replacing. I get the sense that replacing isn't going to happen anytime soon.
No,
It's just going to augment and allow the CFO to continue to drive more value um, throughout the organization.
I would agree with that statement. I would agree that because it's the person who's going to provide the judgment, and
Right.
AI will just provide you information. And not sure if you saw this, but I think it was last year, sometime earlier last year, a law firm in New York tried to do the whole court case on AI and was pulling information that wasn't necessarily correct or real or valid, and that law firm got disbarred. So you need a human to jump in there and say, does this make sense?
Yeah, 100%. And then there's a prioritization aspect. You can point to problems all day long, but I think there's some element of just understanding, what are the priorities with near term, midterm, long term, and how to balance that because you've got to let some things fall through. And so I'm not sure AI has that wherewithal, but hey, things are evolving quick, so it'll probably get there. Um, on the sort of planning side, how do you approach that as a CFO? Financial planning and analysis, the idea of looking forward from 3 years, 5 years, maybe more, all the way down to the budget and kind of that cadence that you get into as far as looking at your performance against the budget and reforecasting. Tell me a bit about your philosophy.
Sure. I've noticed with banks, most companies have kind of report back to because they have some kind of debt, some kind, and they're always looking for, give me a 3, 5 year plan. And I'll be straightforward. 5 year plans, I think, typically aren't really much value because the reality is most companies can see 1 or 2 years out in terms of what they can forecast. 30 years more of a guess. Beyond that, it's just flipping a coin. So you pull all your information together and you try to tie it back to your strategic plan. What is it that we want to achieve and how are we going to get there? And you have specific pieces that you want or customers that you want to target or go after or potentially acquisitions you want to go after. And you need to know what all these are. And you talk to all the stakeholders with the organization. They will feed that information to you. You being the CFO are kind of that conduit. You're that middle person. So you got to go back to the CEO and say, here's what we got. This is what we're planning. That CEO turns around, makes decisions doing this, but we are doing this. And you got to pull that information together. And then from there, you sit there and say, what's the climate look like? What's the economic climate look like? Is this going to make sense? So you got to look at things like forecast Bank of Canada. What do they see going into the future? Is this in our particular industry? What do we see in our industry? And then pull together uh, a plan for 1 year, 2 year, 3 years. I don't like going beyond 3 years because I think after that you're just wasting people's time. What you want to keep in mind is you always want to be conservative. So you always want to make sure that you think it's something you can hit. If it's really stretching out there, it's of no value because you're not going to make it. People are going to be upset. So you got to have something realistic. Once you have it nailed down, it gets approved by the board. You always have to revisit it. So it's always a constant look. When we were at Discount, we would meet once a week and constantly look at our marketplace, how is it evolving, how we might potentially change. Does it still align with the strategic plan? What are we going forward? So you always have, it's an evolution and it never stops. And I think if companies do that, they will be successful. A lot of companies budget, throw it into the drawer, and they throw the strategic plan in the drawer, and they just follow whatever happens. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. But you have to have a conscious decision as to what you're doing based on information, so that way you can address it and take some action.
And you had mentioned in our conversations that, the sort of Monday morning, the huddles and the meetings and the management sessions. Are you bringing that into those? And it's almost like a living, breathing aspect that's just always talked about, always revisited. Because you talked about not putting in the drawer, but how
Yeah,
present is it in the kind of day to day?
I'll give you an example. So this happened. I'll give you two examples actually. So I think which would be really helpful. Our plan at Discount was to grow through trucks and SUVs and get it to customers who need those. And then one time, this is a flood in Calgary, and there was a disaster, and people needed vehicles. A lot of cars were out of commission. There was an opportunity for us to rent in there, and so we had there was a significant number of vehicles in Port Vancouver that we could have picked up, which we did, around it to bring it into the Calgary area. But we did realize back to the Knox wasn't so good. But this was more about not just taking advantage of a situation, but helping people. So you sit there and say, okay, this is going to go off our plan because we're actually buying cars, not buying SUVs and trucks, but we're here to actually Calgary. We're here to make sure that we're known for doing the right thing and help our insurance partners because our insurance partners turns around and says, we need these vehicles. We have all these customers out, so we got to satisfy our insurer. So now you're kind of deviating from your strategic plan to some degree, but you consciously do it knowing you're helping a partner, which is an insurance company, you're helping the people of Calgary, and you're trying to do something good. Our profitability is going to drop, yes, but the reality is we know when we're at a certain point, we're going to have a plan. So you have to adjust. And the second example I was going to use was COVID. We were growing the business and doing really well. We sold the company, and it was late in 2019, and it was going to close June 2020. And then March 18th, 2020, it hit us 58% reduction in revenue in one day. The Canadian market just shut down. You sit there and go, are we going to follow our strategic plan? Are we going to follow our budget? Not necessarily. We have to adjust and we have to do something different. So you always have to adjust because you're right. It's living, breathing, evolving document, and your goals in the future might change from growing the business to surviving in the business to closing a deal. So things could change, and you just have to be adaptive to it.
And it could be being opportunistic. An unforeseen opportunity comes your way and you want to pounce on it. How are you paying for it?
Exactly, exactly, and that does happen too.
Right. Did that deal end up closing as anticipated between March and June, or did it
No,
throw a
so
big a
so what
big
happened
snag?
was we ended up closing it September 1st, 2020. It was a couple months late. Uh, we were a lot had to happen in that time period when that happened on March 18th. I had to go talk to the banks, restructure our covenants. Two, we laid off about 40% of our staff. Three, we were holding on to a lot of vehicles with a lot of debt. We could and Canada was shut down. Fortunately for us, we opened up a US sub. We moved half our vehicles down to the US, sold them off in the US. So we had to really restructure quickly. And we also had to focus in on our receivables too to make sure we could drive the money in to keep us afloat. We actually did a pretty good job because we managed to get ourselves back to profitability in 90 days and close that deal quite successfully. And the owners were happy with the outcome. So, you just have to adjust when things happen. The one takeaway I had from that was, which I want to share with everybody, as a CFO, you always have to be confident. I remember people telling me they knew we were going to be okay during COVID because I was walking down the hall like I didn't have a care in the world, everything was fine. They say, we're in big trouble, aren't we? I'd say, no, we're fine. We're in a good place. I had a plan, it's moving forward. And they told me that that confidence made them feel good so they can continue doing what they were doing. It's a team effort. You got to be encouraging, you got to be confident, they got to be able to follow you.
Love that. The confidence. Um, I think that extends, to your management team, your CEO, your entire internal team, employees, and what have you, uh, partners, uh, companies that you're doing a deal with, that you were selling to, or that you're acquiring. Bankers, they look to CFOs many times for a level of confidence. So I think it's a really important point to drive home.
And
So
we also
thanks.
had, you're right, you hit a lot of key groups that the owner as well, and as well as other partners we had. For example, we had Europcar, which we was one of our partners, and made them feel that yeah, we were fine. Don't worry about it. We're good. We're in a good place.
Yeah, yeah. And I think that's unfortunately not going to happen when you don't have somebody in that seat that's been there, done that, seen it, and can really provide advice from having been through it. Because confidence, if you're just you know born that way, I mean that's a good thing. But again, it comes with having seen the good, the bad, the ugly, and it also probably comes from having a good handle on what we talked about, which is the strategic plan, and knowing what that impact is going to do from a numbers perspective, and then be able to step back and say, here's how that impacts the big picture.
I wanted to say one thing on that because I would say COVID was probably, I wouldn't say the most difficult thing I ever experienced in my career. It was the second most. And the reason is because I had done turnarounds in my past. Because remember, I told you at the beginning, CFOs need to have a certain number of criteria to do, and I've done turnarounds. There was one turnaround I thought was extremely difficult. I thought it was almost impossible, but it made. When COVID hit, the CEO came to me and he said, "Have you ever seen anything this bad?" And I said, "Yes, I've seen worse." And he said, "You've seen worse?" I said, and he said, "Explain it to me." He said, "Well, I went into a company previously when I was restructuring. They had no money. They had tons of debt. Creditors were going to shut them down. Banks were going to foreclose on them. I went in as a CFO. On the first day, they told me I owed personally $500,000 because they hadn't paid source deductions to CRA, which I had nothing to do with. And they had great technology. And so we managed to restructure it, raise money, public, and we sold it. And that was a very difficult thing to do. He said, "So what's different about this?" And I said, "What's different about this is that you have banks who are willing to work with us. You have governments who are willing to work with you. You have the whole environment that's willing to work with you, your vendors and everybody else. And this had nothing to do with us. It was external." I think your experiences define who you are, and it also helps you you can draw on those experiences to be successful.
Yeah, for sure. You talked a little bit about contract work you've done. So you've had longer tenures, shorter tenures, and then some of these interim contract type of opportunities. A couple of things I want to know there. One is when it comes to industry, how difficult do you find it getting to know a new industry? Because you've done that a few times throughout your career. So give us a little bit of perspective on that.
Sure. The way I look at it is that you have your skill set. Your skill set is about business, about accounting, about seeing things, about how to dig and solve problems. The key is really this, how to solve problems. If you have a standard approach, look at the issues, come up with the alternatives, analyze it, conclude, and you recommend to take some action, you can always figure it out. So every time I've gone into somewhere, for example, Scotia Mortgage Corp, when I got thrown in there, never seen it before. How to do it? Well, I spent a ton of time, just got dug into the information. That gave me the confidence I could do anything. I've got into industrial technology, I've got into the internet, gone into medical device, nuclear engineering, a safety company, aviation, automotive. What I find it's more of a challenge. If you have an open mind, you're willing to learn, you can go in and you can look at it and say, okay, this is unique. How do I deal with this? They must make money here somehow. It's all about the curiosity and try to figure out how little pieces work. And the best place to start typically is your balance sheet. You look at your balance sheet and see what, break it all down, and then talk to people. And I think what's very valuable is the fact that I've seen so many different industries. You can draw on information from different industries and question, why do you do it this way? And I hear this frequently. Excuse me. People say the same thing. We've always done it that way. And then, well, what if you did it this way? Like how? Well, that won't work. Why not? And then you have the conversation. So I really thrive on the curiosity piece. And you have to be a curious person if you want to be able to transverse different industries and be a CFO. Because even if you're in your own industry for a long time, you still got to be curious. You still got to be turning around and say, do it this way. Does it make sense? Does it make sense? Is this the most profitable way we can do it? So curiosity, I would say, is the key thing that someone needs to possess if they're going to transfer over into different industries.
I think a really important takeaway, it's not just that, hey, a seasoned CFO with curiosity can do it. In other words, can get into a new industry and figure it out. It's in fact that they might bring something that you wouldn't get with someone who has been in your industry for their entire career. They're bringing outside thinking, challenging the status quo, and for many companies and many industries, that's really important. And so I think that's a real important takeaway. I spend a lot of times convincing business owners to consider somebody from outside their industry, and sometimes it's because there's a skill that they need, whether it's for an M&A transaction or a capital raise. And I encourage them to, weight that more, somebody that's going to be really effective at managing or navigating those transactions versus someone that, knows all their acronyms and their lingos. So that's an interesting topic, one that we can certainly, I think, impart some education on folks and spend more time delving into. Kind of a gear change would be something that we both share in common, which is membership with FEI, Financial Executives International, and both big fans of it. Me being newer to FEI, you being a longtime FEI member. And you've also served on the board as chair and various other functions. Yeah, tell us a bit about FEI, your experience with it, and why you really encourage folks to get involved with organizations like that.
Sure. I hadn't heard of it until I was restructuring this company, and our board member turned around and said, "This company, this organization." I said, "Why would I want to do that?" He says, "Well, you meet people from different industries." And I said, "Yeah, so." He said, "Well, that would be really helpful because you can understand how they think, and maybe you can share ideas and maybe learn some things from other people that have experiences different than you." I thought, okay, sounds like a good idea. So I joined. And in fact, I found it very valuable because one, people were very friendly, open to having discussions. And there were times when I was restructuring, I turned around and said, I have no clue how to do this. And I'd reach out to somebody from FEI, and that person would say, yeah, I've seen this before. This is what you do. And they'd walk you through the process. And I thought, oh, this is great. Almost became like free consultant. And then from there, I made some friends, and they have some good CPA hours. So you can get your hours from there. They have some good dinner events. And it's flexible. So you can do some webinars, and they have some interesting annual conferences. You can go to different places, and they have great speakers. And the speakers are typically topical, whatever's going on at the time. Those speakers are approachable, and you can actually talk to them further about other issues. So I just found it very useful. I just thought it was probably really good value for your money and for your organization.
Yeah, great. Thanks for sharing. A question we ask our guests is, what would you tell yourself if you can go back in time? What advice would you give yourself, personally, professionally? Yeah, what would you impart on yourself looking back?
Well, professionally, I'd say don't get involved in political organizations because they normally they normally have objectives that don't always follow what your business logic would tell you. So I would tell myself, don't go there because it's kind of counterproductive. So that'd be one thing I'd say to my younger self. I would say from a personal standpoint, work fewer hours. I know it's easy to say, try to delegate more. I think we're all guilty of it. I think the fact that when you get into the finance function, there's a lot to do, right? There is. And so when I was at Discount, we had 1 million transactions a year. I know other people have a lot more than that, but 1 million, right? And you're responsible for that in a lot of ways. So really what it comes down to is you got to try to figure out how do you work smarter and not longer. And we all have the tendency to jump in and work longer because you get sucked into the detail. This is where you need to be able to set up your CFOs kind of more higher level. Controller helps you with some of the detail. Other people pull stuff out. And back to AI, I think AI is going to be really helpful to pull information out. So to be beneficial to help people work less. So I'd say try to figure out a way how you can work less. Life is short, and you don't want to be in the office all the time. I'd be the first one to say I'm guilty of being been in the office way too long. At one point, I was called Team Philo. First out, I don't think you want to be that anymore.
Right. Right. LIFO,
Philo,
last in. No, no,
LIFO's
but
good.
LIFO is a good one too. Like last in, first out.
Yeah.
Um, that's awesome. Hey, we just going back to something that we touched on with the contracts and the interim experience, and I honed in on industry. The other part of that that I wanted to hear from you is just having been in both seats, longer term, permanent roles. I hate the term permanent, but there's not a better one that I can come up with versus the contract space. Provide a little bit of insight, to which ones you enjoyed more or less, and sort of why, and what advice you would give to folks that are considering a foray into the world of contract.
Okay. So typically with contracts, they have a term. So you're in for 3 months, a year, whatever the term is. And there's normally defined deliverables. We want you to come in, the person's gone on maternity leave, you need to hold the fort. That's an example. So you go and do that. But it's really not your position. You're just you're keeping it going, you're providing some information, what you might be able to change. There's other contracts turn around, can you help us make some change? You want to do this in 6 months. Can you give me an example? I had one of those. I was at Vector Aerospace. They said, come on in, we need you to implement IFRS. This is back in 2010, and they want to have IFRS put in and get away from Canadian GAAP. They're a public company. It takes a year and a half to do. They hadn't started. They brought me in to do it in 6 months. Seemed like a daunting task. So you have a timeline. So to me, that was a challenge. It was fun, but it's not for everybody because some people like that, some people don't. So you just have to know what you're in for. So there's a timeline. On permanent side, you have a longer window, you have a longer runway, you have a strategy that's set out. This is what you want to do. You partner up with the CEO, trying to figure out whether it's going to be deals you're going to be doing or just growing the business and how you can provide the appropriate information to keep the company going. And you develop relationships. You develop relationships with everybody you work with, the finance team, the other groups, and it can be very rewarding because you can really like the people and you can shape the culture. So, you can shape that culture as being a leader.
Yeah, interesting. I appreciate you sharing the perspective. I think there's another segment of companies and opportunities whereby it's not sort of plugging a gap, and I think you spoke to this in the IFRS example, but it's something that they need that they can't get done with their current structure. And so I think those are interesting where you have the opportunity to go into a company that doesn't know what they don't know. And, that's more of a finite deliverable. And you kind of could say there's a starting point and an ending point. But I really like the idea where there's a certain need. Maybe they have a controller, but they've never had a CFO and they just want to maybe get help. Hey, can you help us build some forward looking strategic capabilities like a budget? And then from there the opportunities become, man, we didn't know like how much of an impact you can have. Now can you do this and that, um, and take it to a whole new level. So I think that can open up a channel that may not otherwise be there.
I want to throw out there to that point. When I was at Vector, I came in as a 6-month contract, and after that finished, they put the company had unsolicited offers. So they said, "Hey, we need you longer. Can you help us with the M&A?" Sure. So I went in and helped them sell the company. Then, we finished that, and they said, "Hey, can you do a contract? Can you go to Paris and restructure one of our companies?" I said, "Sure." So I went to Paris, restructured a company. Then they sent me to the UK and did that there. Then they brought me across Canada and restructured a bunch of units that they had across Canada. And then they came back and said, "Okay, you're really good. We'd like to make you the president of the Australian division." And that's when I went to my wife and said, "Okay, I got this offer." but she didn't want. I guess my point is, you never know where it can lead. Um, Other opportunities that can come from it, because I think what they see is they see you have the ability to tackle problems, and there's always problems. Every company has problems. So you just need the person with the right mindset to try to figure out how you can solve those problems. They also need the tools too, so they need to be supported, because if they're not supported, they won't be successful. So just throwing that out there too.
So, David, as you've gone through these stories and these examples and these insights, it's clear that from the outset of the conversation, when you mentioned, the intention and to get all these experiences, um, that you've really done it all. And so, my joke at the beginning, what haven't you done? Again, I just think you've covered so much ground. It's super impressive. What is next for you? What is maybe is there uncharted territory for you, or is it to take what you've done and continue to help others? Because I know you've spoken about the importance of that and mentorship and advisory, for businesses. So yeah, what are you thinking as far as what's next?
Well, as I said from the beginning, I really enjoy the CFO role. So I think my next role would be back to somewhere, or potentially helping a company with finance needs. So I'm just open at the moment looking for the next one. I don't really know, but it comes down to a few attributes: good people, some growth opportunity, some challenges. That's exciting, right? So it's exciting to be part of a growth opportunity with challenges and good people who want to all direction. That could be in almost any kind of setting. Hence, I keep myself open to industry, because those criteria could be anywhere. So I'd say that's it at this point in time.
Yeah. Well, I'm excited to see what's next. Really pleased to have had you on the podcast and appreciate you joining and hope you'll do it again sometime soon. Thanks, David.
Thank you for having me, David. It's a pleasure, and thanks for moderating. I enjoyed the time. Thank you very much.